Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to the Keeping It Retail webcast series. We've had about 20 weeks of really great content, so thank you so much for sticking with us and joining us again today. My name is Rose Spicer, and I am responsible for retail marketing here at Oracle Retail. We're pleased to have a really nice turnout of so many members of the Oracle community on the webcast today. Before we begin, I want to run through a couple housekeeping items, then we'll get started. The webcast run about 30 minutes in content, leaving plenty of time for Q&A. We do want to keep this conversational and fluid, so if you have a question as John and Franklin are presenting, feel free to put that into the Q&A panel, and we'll address that as they come through. We are going to let the guys run through the presentation, and then we'll hold the questions to the end of the presentation. If you have any technical issues, though, feel free to use the same box, and we'll try and handle those immediately. Our speakers today are Franklin Pacheco and John Bible. Franklin works in our Latin American market and does a wonderful job working with our customers to help prove out business value. And then John Bible works in our insight team and works to really help build business cases. And so I don't want to steal any more thunder. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Franklin, to walk us through the content today. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hello, everyone. And Rose, thank you for that introduction. And thank you so much for everyone in joining the webcast today. It is very nice to have you all sharing our point of view or perspective about the industry, especially in such an interesting and particular times. Today, what we want to do, we want to go over the role that the supply chain has been playing in keeping the industry running in a time when supply chain disruptions in both inventory and also data and information has been like never seen before. And it has probably changed fundamentally the way that we've been doing fulfillment, supply chain, and retail in general. So when we had to put the content together for this presentation, something that I wanted to do was to go online and find out what people were saying about retail, find out what people were saying about the trends of the industry during COVID-19, during the year 2020, a year that is probably going to be remembered by most of us for a really long time. And the first recurrence that came from Google was not very encouraging. It's retail is dead. And the second one is not nearly as bad, but it's still not very encouraging, is that retail is dying. And for someone who has been working in the industry for a number of years, this is something that is probably, I don't know if we should laugh about it or should worry about it, but in reality, it seems to be like the industry, like many other segments in the market, are really going through a hard time. I don't believe this is nowhere near a fact. I think this predicament from Google, it's absolutely incorrect. And what we want to do today is show some of the numbers, some of the data that are actually showing that the industry is moving in a very optimistic yet challenging times. So the first number that we wanted to review, it's probably the indicator that is most relevant to most retailers out there, is sales. What are we doing from a sales perspective? So we're not going to sugarcoat it. 2020 has been a very, very difficult, very challenging year. So analysts are seeing contractions in retail sales close to 11, 10%. And keep in mind, this is actually a moving target. These numbers came out about a month, 2 months ago. The projections for market contraction in retail sales in North America in 2020 were just over 10%. So very significant. Yet, not everything is bad news. Analysts are also agreeing that in 2021 and 22, the market is probably going to bounce back, and we're going to be seeing numbers similar to what we were having prior to the pandemic just in 2022. Is this written in stone? Probably not, but everyone seems to agree that eventually, after we go back to a sense of normality, or we truly embrace the new normal, we're going to be seeing very, very optimistic numbers in 2021 and 2022 and moving forward. Even during 2020, not everything has been bad news. There has been significant growth, at least in online sales. So online sales definitely being the #1 engine for growth in North America and globally as well. So we've seen growth of up to 18% in online sales in North America during 2020, and have become just shy of 15% of retail sales in North America. And this seems to be happening all over the planet. So those huge numbers of increments in online sales happening in North America has been replicated all around the globe. In fact, this is not anything new. The fact that online sales were growing is something that was happening prior to the pandemic. If you see the numbers of 2019, we were already seeing a very significant increment in online sales. In fact, I was lucky enough to find these projections that came in just a few days prior to COVID hitting the news. Before we were spending all of our time watching the news, seeing how the world was changing with COVID-19, these numbers came through, and actual growth rate year by year of online sales across many different categories, apparels, auto parts, all the way to toys and hobbies, they were pretty much around double digits. So pretty significant growth in this channel. So it is not new. Probably just COVID exponentially incremented the amount of online sales. And interesting enough, projections prior to the pandemic around food and beverages, and I highlighted it in right here on the right, projections on food and beverages and health, personal care and beauty were the categories that were estimated to grow the most prior to the pandemic, before COVID was a thing. Retail was still struggling, defining new processes, new ways of doing things to account for this exponential growth in online demand from consumers. Some retailers were doing a fantastic job with to account for prior to the pandemic. 2020 came here, a year that again is going to be remembered by many of us for many, many years. And those 19% expectations of growth or 16% expectations of growth that were very, very challenging for retailers to account for grew all the way to 60% in food and beverages, and health and beauty, 32.4%. And again, this keeps being a moving target, but definitely at least 3 times over what we were thinking was going to happen prior to COVID-19 being a thing. This gave tremendous amount of stress to supply chain across retailers in the planet that were already struggling to keep up with the increasing demand of online sales and distribution. To that, the industry tried to react as soon as possible. And I do believe that this increment in online sales was in one portion because of consumer behavior, consumer forced behavior to buy online, but also the retail industry was forcing this behavior. So companies like Walmart, Kroger's, Albertson were focusing like their omni-channel fulfillment, and we're actually encouraging buyers to buy online due to the different limitations in store operations hour, limitations in number of workers being available to fulfill products in the stores. So there was both consumers but retailers pushing towards this direction. And of course, very, very creative ideas around how to fulfill this exponential or exponential demand. So companies like Whole Foods, Kroger's, Stop and Shop, using their dark stores, this concept of stores that were closed or partially closed as e-commerce fulfillment centers. So having the ability to use these locations that were closer to the consumer to fulfill online orders and quickly transition from a fully brick and mortar operation on a posh or a very heavily loaded brick and mortar operation to a more omni-channel environment. And not only when it comes down to supply chain and fulfillment. Walmart China, for instance, they did replanning of their assortment. So all the way back to planning the assortment and category management initiative, determining the products that were really, really important during, at least during the first part of the pandemic, and prioritizing the replenishment and assortment of those products. This would also allow for reconfiguration of the way that we do online picking in both warehouses and physical store locations. If we're talking about online sales, we definitely need to address the elephant in the room. So what is happening with #1 online sale retailers in North America? So talking about Amazon, of course. So Amazon has been doing very well during the pandemic. Prior to it, they already control about 38% of the online retail market in North America. That's a huge number. And the Financial Times came up with an article just a few months ago in June 2020, listing 100 companies that were doing really, really well during the pandemic. And not so came up as #1. So if this exponential growth of online sales seems to be such an important trend, during COVID-19, of course, the biggest player has to be doing well. Their stock going up every day. Financially, they're doing very well. And of course, they truly understood that this incremental growth in sales is only sustainable if they go back and reinvest heavily in supply chain activities and in supply chain to execute the fulfillment of this increase in demand. However, and I cannot emphasize this enough, yes, Amazon as number one is doing very well. During the pandemic, they grew about 20%, but they're not the retailer that is growing the most in online sales during the pandemic. If you look at numbers from companies like Best Buy or Costco, the Home Depot, look at Target or Walmart, they're all growing significantly in online sales during the pandemic. You can argue that, well, maybe the baseline of online sales of these companies were not the same that Amazon had. But in reality, they were already doing well, and now they're growing significantly for a number of reasons, and we'll discuss why. With this acceleration and exponential over exponential that we're discussing of online sales, we can't help in wondering, is this just an exception? After the pandemic, are we going to go back to normal? Are we going to go back to the way we were doing things in 2019? It's just a thing of a year or a couple of years. Eventually, we'll be over this. Eventually, like we're gonna find a vaccine. Eventually, we're gonna go back to normality. And the question is, are we gonna go back to the way things were in 2019? We're talking about something absolutely different in the world of retail moving out of the pandemic. So I do believe that perceptions really, really matters. We just went over some numbers and we said, well, in 2019, online sales accounted for about 11% of total retail sales in North America. And even during the pandemic, with this exponential growth, it was still shy of 15%. But IDC conducted a survey in September 2020, asking consumers, how much of your retail dollar spend do you believe you purchase online? And the numbers are pretty incredible. Pre-pandemic, consumers have a perception, and again, this is just a perception because we went over factual numbers just a second ago. They answered that about 40% of their dollar spent in retail was done in online sales distribution. During the pandemic, that number went up significantly, all the way to 72. The actual one is 15%, but consumer perception matters. And then after the pandemic, if you ask them, what do you think your consumer behavior is going to be coming out of the pandemic? Most of them are going to answer, look, we're going to buy online a lot more than what we were buying prior to the pandemic. And again, this is not something only in North America. It is happening all over the world. These numbers are coming in from South America. A retailer like Mercado Libre, one of the biggest online players in the region, they saw about 20% of their consumers purchasing for the first time a food and beverage item online, something that never did before. And the percentage of growth in these categories in this region is even more significant than in North America. So if you look, growth up to 300% of health and medical, 164 in CPG and food. So very, very significant growth. It would be naive to believe that after this exposition of consumer to a different channel of purchasing items, especially in health and beauty and food and beverages, people are just going to go back to buying the way they bought prior to the pandemic. And I think that the important question to answer is, what is going to happen with consumers once we transition from a forced consumer behavior? Because whether we like it or not, the way that we're buying today has a lot of forced component to it. We're being forced, because of the pandemic and because we want to be safe, to buy in a way that otherwise we probably would do differently. So what is going to happen once we transition from a forced consumer behavior to a desirable consumer behavior? People are saying they're not going to go back to what they were doing back in 2019. They are going to leverage on that experience, and probably the balance of power between brick and mortar and online sales is going to be totally different. So does that mean COVID-19 was the final nail on the coffin of traditional stores? I do believe absolutely not. In fact, numbers, again, are saying totally otherwise. For the first time ever, and this is something that I consider to be very interesting, Walmart.com, Walmart online surpasses online sales in comparison to eBay. Since the very beginning of online sales, for the first time we were able to buy any products using a computer or a tablet, eBay was number 2. Now, Walmart went all the way to number 2, and then you see companies like Apple, Home Depot, Best Buy, Target, ranking very high on the online sales distribution. And the reason for that, it's clearly proximity. It's clearly that traditional brick and mortar location that allows you for a true omni-channel supply chain distribution and not losing that connection with the consumer. If online sales were the only answer to omni-channel, to retail in the new normal, you wouldn't have companies like Amazon heavily investing in traditional brick and mortar distribution, like the investment in Whole Foods, but also moving forward in more opening of locations. So we don't believe this is the end of traditional stores. It's just another transformation over transformation that we have been experiencing since before the pandemic was a thing. Now, the problem is that omni-channel fulfillment, of course, seems to be king and seems to be the answer of the new normal. Yet, this exponential over exponential growth is adding significant stress in retail's net profit at the end of the day. We just discussed that prior to the pandemic, retailers were trying to accommodate this double-digit growth in online distribution, but with this exponential over exponential, what we have been seeing across sales going up in retailers that were considered essential, so food and beverage distribution going up in general, but not necessarily their final profit was going up. In many cases, we were seeing negative numbers because the added cost of online sales and fulfillment and home delivery was so incredibly high, especially for an industry that was not ready for such an increment in online distribution, that at the end of the day, the net profit in many cases is being negative. Does that mean that we're underestimating the complexity of an omnichannel operation in the new normal? I do believe yes. In many cases, that is the case. We can't increase prices of products trying to inflate the margins artificially and see how the operation runs out. But in reality, it's as we get used to the new normal, retailers are going to be getting better and better at doing online distribution. So the way to do this is to first consider what is the true complexity of omnichannel fulfillment. And I want to take a very quick example. Let's say we're taking about a retailer of mid-sized retailer, nothing too huge, but not too small, about 200 suppliers and maybe operating around 3 distribution centers, 200 locations in different cities, different geographies, and just about 10,000 items, 10,000 SKUs. If we're adding the complexity of an omnichannel fulfillment, we can say, well, we're going to be interacting with 1 million customers, and maybe anything in between 10 to 1 million customer orders a year seems to be very reasonable. It's still conservative. If we consider this omnichannel fulfillment, and we do the math, very quick math, adding this element of 15 million orders a year, well, we're looking at no less than 2.73 trillion intersections influencing demand calculation. And that's trillion with a T, not with a B. That's a lot of data to have that we have to analyze. Just from a supply chain planning perspective, the new normal is just adding more and more data into a reality that was already very challenging. What we can do with it, it's different alternatives. So retailers over the past few years, they started predicting demand using simply time series. So if we think about retail about 10 or 15 years ago, and the assortment was very basic, we had products with long life cycle, nothing of the sort of supply chain disruptions that we're seeing in COVID-19, the average sales being very high, well, time series from a supply chain planning perspective, we're going to cut it. Retail became a little more complex, so life cycle of products became shorter, items were changing more and more, and then the demand was a lot more erratic. So the industry came up with enhanced time series. And that's probably a way to fix a big chunk of the challenges that we have even today, but it's not nearly enough. The problem is, what do we do in a time when supply chain disruptions are all over the place and the fragmentation of demand is so high that we're looking at trillions of intersections to be analyzed? There's not really an easy answer. So the first thing that we can do, and it's kind of very tempting, is to maybe just escalate the data. We see, well, we cannot analyze products at the product level anymore. It's too erratic, it's too unreliable. We don't know what consumers are going to be buying a product or another one. We don't know when we're going to be having supply chain disruptions. So we're going to try to escalate this all the way to, let's say, a group or a category or a subclass. That is tempting, and the data is more reliable at that level, but it's very imprecise. You can't assume that every single item within the family is going to behave the same. So how about we change the way that we think about assortment? If we stop thinking about sales of items, if we stop thinking about product, people or consumers buying products, and we start thinking about consumers buying attributes within a product, now we are depending on something that is highly reliable, an attribute, a characteristic of an item, that is also very precise. Because even if the assortment is very erratic, even if a product is absolutely new, even if the item is seeing the light of day for the first time today, the characteristics that compose this item, the characteristics that are part of the products, might not be new. So we can't rely on a recomposition of those attributes to understand product demand, regardless of the number of intersections. The challenge is, and again, attribute-based forecasting is not a new concept. The problem is, how do we now determine which attributes are really key? Are all of those valid? Can we say that analyzing every single characteristic, every single attribute of a product is going to provide an answer to understanding demand during time of very high demand volatility? Absolutely not. But if we rely on a true prescriptive approach, we can analyze probably every single intersection we want. So let's say we analyze an intersection of bottle of sodas, 2 liters could be an attribute, and we analyze this at a national level. And then we go for an attribute being organic products, and then we just analyze this at a state level. Or we can even see another category of products in a store locations. And imagine this being exploded and it's as many combinations as possible, going all the way up to trillions of combinations. What we can do using a prescriptive approach is determine which intersections are truly relevant, and the ones that are not, the ones that do not present any data consistency, we simply remove from the analysis. This is a next step in understanding how product attributes can truly influence demands, but not analyzing intersections that are not really relevant to my analysis. And then finally, which is something that I feel very strongly about, is how do we add another dimension of the analysis, which really present a change in an old paradigm of how do you do right product at the right time and in the right place, which is really old, and it doesn't really play well in modern retail, especially coming out of the pandemic. We need to change that element for another one, considering what is the right time for my consumer to buy a product. When do I think that a particular consumer is going to buy a product? Retailers tend to have tremendous amount of consumer data. So if we can't identify that consumer data and make it part of the analysis as an additional attribute or an additional dimension, and now we can start predicting, when do I believe that a chronic patient is more likely to buy medicine? When do I believe that a new mother is more likely to buy milk for their infants? Or where do I believe that a single consumer is more likely to issue purchase of any goods? So we incorporate consumer behavior into the analysis. We're now moving into the next step of true prescriptive approach that is really closing the bridge between not having enough data from COVID or from any disruption in supply chain to something that is a lot more reliable depending on product attributes and consumer attributes. This, we believe, would really catapult the supply chain to a new generation or a new paradigm of usage of supply chain planning and analytics. With that being said, what I want to do very quickly, I don't want to keep this just in the academical work. We do believe there has to be an actual way to put all of this theoretical knowledge to practice. And with that, I want to invite my colleague, John Bible, who is also in the webcast, to introduce you very quickly about how can we actually achieve this in a very practical way and have retailers such as yourself moving into the next generation of supply chain planning and execution. So John, with that, I'll transition to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Franklin. Yes, if you could go to the next slide. So as Franklin mentioned, we want to talk about what we can do immediately to help you right now. So obviously, the first thing we have to all acknowledge is that in many countries, COVID-19 is surging. Now, there's real positive news on vaccines. So, I think the end is hopefully in sight. But nevertheless, I think anybody would say probably for the next 12 months or so, COVID is going to be very much a fact of life. And we've already seen what it's been doing. It creates these bullwhip effects through the supply chain. Essentially, if you have, say, panic buying, say suddenly everybody's buying toilet paper, that just ripples up the supply chain because, supermarkets are trying to secure supply, so it just amplifies. And the next thing you know, there's no availability. So, we can expect more sort of extreme demand and supply disruptions, unlike anything that's been seen before in living memory. I think of it, the real question is, say, like, who's going to be the winner in 2021, because this is such an extraordinary period. Some retailers will probably be shut down, others will kind of come up ahead. So this is really sort of a critical moment. And the other point too here is, if you're sort of managing things by your gut, sort of your 30 years of experience, it doesn't really apply now. So as Franklin mentioned, we've had some really exciting advances on the machine learning side. We can look at way more data than ever before, discern patterns, etc. So what we're trying to do is how do we bring all these advances in power within, prescriptive analytics, and also, help our customers become winners when the dust sort of settles after all this extraordinary disruption. Next slide, Franklin. So, we think a lot of it boils down to shelf availability. So as customers are seeking critical items, you just have I've never seen so many empty shelves sort of walking through a supermarket as I have in the past 12 months. I'm sure that's a pretty common experience. So we believe that one sort of critical leverage point to be one of the winners, as everything shifts around here competitively, is to maintain shelf availability. And it's very challenging. Like I said, supply chains are disrupted. Suddenly vendors are, much more unreliable than you've ever seen before. You have all these demand surges, changes in buying behavior, how you, curbside pickup, all these things are sort of making it very challenging. But I think that a lot of the winner retailers, say, 12 months from now, will be the ones who maintain shelf availability better than their competition. Next slide, please. And the other piece of this is really managing at the customer, store level. You want to hold on to and grow your customers. Now, I believe a lot of that is driven by superior shelf availability, but you really want to be managing at the customer level. Understand your segments like never before, and then, do the appropriate promotions, change your assortments. I think that all this change in shopping behavior that's been forced on everybody, it's changing habits. So we've never had a situation where the entire world is changing its shopping habits. So again, we're really thinking hard on how we can bring, prescriptive analytics to make sure you sort of come out on top against your competition. Okay, next slide. So what we'd like to offer, so we want to be very scientific about this. So to us, it all starts with data. So if you're willing to supply us with data at the transaction level, we can scientifically prove, with the data, what customer trends are occurring, what sort of supply chain shocks have you been experiencing, and we can bring that to, actionable decisions. What assortment changes you should make, how you should tune your automated replenishment systems, forecasts we can backcast on the COVID period, even before, and just come back and sort of show to you very specifically with your data down at the most granular level, all these trends we're talking about and how you can sort of come out as a winner as we get through the rest of this extraordinary period. So it's optimizing replenishment, incorporating the customer dimension as Franklin mentioned, so we can prove how much that improves the forecast accuracy with your own history. And then also a lot of it too is how do you, manage all the data with this disruption? How do you sort of de-COVID the history? Those are things we can do very rapidly with our tools, and we'd like to prove it to you. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So Franklin, next slide.
Right.
Great. So thank you, John and Franklin. I think one of the most important things that is the takeaways, that assessment that John was just talking about is free. So John, can you just talk a little bit about the type of data? You said transaction data. Could you elaborate on that? And then also talk about whether or not it's a prerequisite to have any particular solutions of Oracle's?
Sure. So we're looking at sales and demand, demand and supply information. That's what we're trying to prescriptively model. So the base data set would be several years, 2 to 3 years of SKU, store, week or day history, sales and inventory. So we want to see what inventory positions you had in the past, and then of course, what were the sales against it. Now, if you don't have inventory down, like, on hands at the daily level, we can take weekly or monthly. So there is flexibility on that. In addition to that, ideally to really get to the customer dimension, we would like to get transaction level data. So we could actually see, now we're not interested in any personally identifying information. So, a random customer loyalty ID is fine. So we don't need to know things about your customers. We just want to know that this particular customer purchased, we just want to see her market baskets over time. So if this person came, say it was a grocery situation, so she shops every Saturday, pretty regularly, and then we can observe exactly what she's purchasing. So that's the main data. And then as far as solutions, no, we don't have any presumptions on that. Just as long as we have the history, we can then apply the machine learning and prove out the analytics.
Okay, beautiful. And then in the 2 to 4 week time period, what kind of walk through what's that timeline and what does that look like? So the retailer provides you with the granular level of data. I assume that there's some NDA or some sort of agreement to make sure that we're respectful of each other in the process. But talk about a little bit about what that looks like. So they give you the data, and then what happens? Does it go away into a think tank? Can you talk about the role of science within the RIPA, as we call it?
Yes. So, really, at the end of the day, this is a big data processing job because, we're applying, machine learning, essentially algorithms, also some optimization. So we're really, you can think of it as scientifically processing your data. So there's the data intake. Now we're happy to take it, we're very flexible in terms of the format of the data, the structure, etc. We have sort of a desired sort of table structure for the data, but it's not a requirement. So the first step is we, sort of review the data automatically, look for anomalies. Of course, we'll expect a lot if you're looking at 2020, but we're pretty familiar at looking at this, and we'll come back just with a test of sort of the cleanliness of the data, sort of play back what we're seeing, also note any outliers, things like that. So once the data passes that quality test, and that would happen in like the first week or so, then we will essentially model the data with our predictive model. So we'll pull out the customer segments, see the trends, etc. And then once we have that, we actually have a simulator built. So we can go through and say, oh, okay, so if you're, your major paper goods suppliers are going to have a lot of unreliability because there's panic buying for, cleaning, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. We can model that in a simulated environment, all based on the demand patterns we've seen in your data, and then come back with, say, the, optimized inventory settings for replenishment. Okay. Also in this simulation too, we can do what's called backcasts. So we could take, 18 months of history, and then predict the last 6 months, and then just see the accuracy, et cetera. So that's all very automated. We just run it through, and then we come back with a report, also actionable replenishment parameters, the forecast model, et cetera.
Okay. And so during the course of the 2 to 4 weeks, it sounds like the heavy lift is more on our side, just analyzing data and then coming back with presentations to the customer.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, thanks for, so we're not about describing the best process. We're not doing a bunch of interviews. It's, we're sort of like lab technicians. You sort of, once we get the data, we don't necessarily have to, have all these discussions with you. We just sort of put it through our CAT scan, and we come back and say, ooh, there's a problem here, just based on the analysis of the data. So, there is some discussion, obviously, for the data intake. We would like to have a validation meeting in terms of the cleaning. We just want to make sure the data is clean. There wasn't any misinterpretation, on the intake side. Then maybe like a meeting or two to show findings as we run it through the simulator and all these models, and then a final presentation. So Excellent. It's really just several meetings. Yep.
Okay. And then just circling back to you, Franklin, once you have kind of a picture of the diagnostics of kind of what's going on with your data and your inventory, then you had talked a little bit, I believe it was RDF you were talking about, where you can look at the different profiles of your products. Can you just talk a little bit about that? And I think what, how do you manage that? Because I think what happens is a lot of people have their high priority items, but the rest of the portfolio is kind of missed. Can you talk a little bit about the automation and the ability to scale some of those really cool things you were talking about with the forecasting?
Sure, absolutely. And yes, and again, Rose, the name of the product, one of the products that we use to achieve this prescriptive approach, it is retail demand forecasting. It's RDF. At the end of the day, it's not really important. We'll come in and we'll define which are the tools that a retailer truly needs to achieve these goals. But you are correct. What we are trying to do, we have actually done already with a number of customers, is transition from an old way of doing forecasting when demand was truly analyzed at the item or aggregations level, and then transition from a new approach. And the problem that we were having with this approach in the past is that we need to evaluate so many artist intersections that without using machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence, it was impossible. So what we're doing today, we have a next generation engine that what it does, it just rid of a lot of concerns that retailers used to have in the past, and knowing what do I think an attribute which attributes are the right ones to evaluate. You don't really have to worry about that. or you don't really have to worry about escalation path, which was also a thing of the past. How do you escalate data in order to produce reliable amount of information that can then be de-aggregated back to the item location intersection? What we do today is we pretty much evaluate every single thing that a retailer believes to be relevant. We can evaluate millions of intersections if that makes sense. And then by using correlationship, the system identify automatically, well, we do believe that those intersections, they are part of an intersection of data, but they're absolutely relevant. There is no conclusion that we can reach from further analyzing any of them. And the ones that do make sense, they then add up to define product life cycle. And every single product is going to have a product life cycle, even if it's a very stable item. It's just a stable life cycle of that particular item. And then that way we're achieving tremendous amount of forecast accuracy by implementing this new prescriptive approach. And it's also yielding very good results, especially during the time of supply chain disruptions such as COVID-19.
Thank you for the clarification, Franklin. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Franklin had referred to a couple trends, consumer behavior trends. We have your first gift of the holiday season. There are no strings attached. You can go and download the PDF and pull the data for yourself. If you have additional inquiries or questions about that data, we can certainly provide that to you. You can reach into that One Retail Voice at oracle.com to request additional slices of the data if you're interested in that. But we're really excited to be able to look at those trends, and we're trying to keep a pulse on what's happening with your customers, so that way we can help guide you down a path that makes us all successful. Because as Franklin had indicated, there's a lot of pressure on retail right now. So we're in it together and we're here to help. So if that consumer research gives you a little bit more insight, then we're happy to provide that. If you want to go to the next slide, Franklin. We have a couple more exciting programs that are coming up. On Thursday, we are featuring Grupo Nazan. They're going to be talking about their customer experience and how omnichannel technology played a role in that. It should be a great panel discussion. We have featured that in Spanish, and now we're doing that in English. So we're thrilled to have those executives with us on Thursday. And then Hellsberg, I did the interview with Nathan Gray, and I'm absolutely excited about the December 3rd webcast that we're going to be doing, talking about some more of the science that both John and Franklin alluded to in the frame of a customer experience. So that's always fun to do. So we hope you guys will join us on December 3rd. And then we have Internet Retailing is going to be hosting our customer Pepco of Europe. We've been working with Emily Henderson to bring in the CFO from the Pepco Europe customer, which is merchandising and financials together. So it's kind of a cool transformational story talking about their experience during the pandemic. So we have a ton of great content that's available in the Keeping It Retail series. We have set up a Netflix binge-worthy episodes page for you to take advantage of. So I encourage you to do that. You'll find that link in the chat. We encourage you to take advantage of that. Without further ado, I'd love to just say thank you to Franklin and to John for giving us your time this morning and sharing your wisdom on supply chain, because it is so important right now, and execution is everything as we come into the holidays. So thank you again, gentlemen, for your time today. And thank you to our audience for taking your valuable time out of your busy day.